weird stuff.
Yeah.
Well, then I can't remember those two London guys that had model girlfriends, and and they were both abusive to their girlfriend, to these very pretty women. So one of the friends of the girlfriend said, you really need to leave. You should get out of this relationship.
Deserve better.
So when he found out that that she was being encouraged to leave the relationship and so on, he stabbed her. He nucleated her left eye, and slashed her face. For a model, that's like really murder in a way because
career. You have no career.
And then he was arrested, and the British court gave him 4 1/3 years. What the fuck? Here he is, attempted murder.
Yeah.
Disfiguring a model.
Leaving her handicapped.
He gets 4 fucking years. I mean, so that the law is really. I've been writing, like in the book that I've been finishing, that the justice has not triumphed over law. There's a lot of cases where the law hasn't caught up with what's going on
culturally, and
because they don't distinguish. In other words, let's say you try to poison somebody, you shoot somebody, but the miracle of modern medicine, they're able to save the person. You obviously meant to kill the person, so attempted murder is no different from murder, so that the sentence shouldn't be a light one.
Yeah,
just right. Because the person happened to have the good fortune to survive, and sometimes not the good fortune to survive, like in that case where Dale Pierre poured lye down the throat of those people in the hi-fi shop in Utah who were, imagine your throat being burned out. They live in three of them died, but one guy who also had a pencil shoved through his ear, come out of his throat, and was like a ruined person for the next bunch of years until he finally died early.
Yeah.
Why would he? Now that guy did get the death penalty, I have to say. So, but then it took years and years, before they finally. Then there's the case of, I think that we read here of this guy Adley who stuck a tree branch up the vagina, all the way to the diaphragm of the girl that had just graduated from the academy down in the Air Force Academy down in Maryland. And he did get the death penalty, but it took 20. She was 18. It took 22 years before they finally executed him because of all the defense attorneys some bullshit excuse.
Different subpoenas and
so
different.
That he was able to live more years than she did, just waiting for the goddamn what I mean?
Case.
Horseshit stuff that goes on.
He got free meals and free health care and everything along the way too, didn't he?
So this is Sarah Kolb. Okay.
Sarah Kolb. Yep.
So, a teenager from a broken family in Moline, Illinois, Sarah Kolb was of an uncertain orientation. She had sex at times with boys, but fashioned herself as a lesbian. She was part of a group of seriously disordered, drug-abusing high school dropouts, of which she was the most domineering, cruel, and sadistic. When a new girl came to town, Adrienne, Sarah at first felt attraction toward the new girl, as she did toward Sarah. Ariane did not do drugs, and she had sex with many different boys, including a Corey Gregory, who saw himself as bisexual and who was a close companion of Sarah's. Her gang was involved with metal piercings, and they took marijuana, ecstasy, and methamphetamine, cocaine, and Xanax. So at one point, Sarah became enraged that Adrienne, and both girls were 16, had sex with this boy, Corey. Sarah lured Adrienne into a car as if to restore their friendship. Instead, Sarah fought with Adrienne and, with Corey's help, strangled Adrienne to death. Realizing the girl was now dead, Sarah figured the best thing to do would be to pour accelerant over the body and burn it to ashes.
Oof.
But this was midwinter in 2005, and the proper degree of heat, which is 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit, couldn't be generated. So Sarah and Corey then decided the next best thing was to use a friend's hacksaw and cut Adrienne a somewhat large body into more manageable pieces to be buried in the woods or in the sewer drains. But Corey broke down and told his father and then the authorities what had happened. The participants were convicted. Sarah was sentenced to life in prison, Corey to 40 years. Looking back, it could be said that Sarah's whole group were truants, school dropouts, and drug addicts from broken working-class families, social rejects who tried to make up for their inadequacies by being tough. Sarah, more than the others, had distinct psychopathic traits. She was callous, there was a lack of remorse, manipulativeness, and pathological lying. Before the murder, she had been medicated for aggressiveness. She had fantasies several years before the murder of killing someone, dismembering the body, and getting away with murder. The case was described in the book about it as replete with evil. So until he was 15, Alec Kreider lived under the radar of the authorities as the middle of 3 children in a divorced family near Lancaster, Pennsylvania. He would divide his time between the 2 parents, a week with one, then a week with the other. He was outwardly normal and had a close friend, Kevin Haynes. Underneath this facade, he was what in recent years has been called the callous, unemotional youth, or else life persistent as opposed to adolescent onset, antisocial type. Alec and Kevin were, at all events, A students and seemed to be good friends. But in May 2007, Alec sneaked into the Haynes home and, armed with a knife, stabbed Kevin's parents to death and then brutally slashed and stabbed his friend, mutilating Kevin's body with multiple wounds. The viciousness of the attack seemed compatible with someone who was in a state of rage. Yet there seemed to be no discernible motive apart from the desire to kill people, which had been smoldering in Alex for a long time. Shortly after the murders, which at first defied solution, Alec became infatuated with a girl, Caroline. He threatened suicide if she didn't become his girlfriend. As a result of his suicidality, he was admitted to a psychiatric hospital. Much as he detested the hospital, toward the end of his 2-week stay, he surprised everyone by confessing to the murders. Alec showed no remorse. He was then arrested, pled guilty, and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Alec had kept a diary which was now open to the public. There were comments that showed his arrogance and his egoism, his contempt for social convention, and his consuming desire to kill people indiscriminately. There were comments that suggested he identified with the Nazis. His diary was described as a portrait of evil. While in prison, he told his cellmates that he would kill again if he were ever released. No clear motive ever came to light. There was no answer to the why of his actions, which seemed to be a reflection of pure hatred of mankind and an overwhelming desire to murder people, even his erstwhile best friend and his family, in a way that was reminiscent of Raskolnikov in Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, where he kills the old lady just to sort of prove that he could kill somebody with no particular motive. Alec had never been abused physically or verbally by either parent, appearing instead as an example of what you might call bad seed, someone with a genetic predisposition to callous, unemotional personality, which is a prelude to the development of psychopathy as you get from your teens into your 20s.
So as you mature, the characteristics kind of evolve into the precursors of it.
Yeah, like a psychopath in embryo, so to speak.
Yeah. So who's the next lovely contributor to society?
Sabrina, that's Sabrina, Limon, Limon.
Okay.
Well, Sabrina Limon lived with her husband Robert and their 2 young children, Robbie and Leanna, in the Tehachapi Silver Lakes region in southeast California, not all that far from Los Angeles, near Bakersfield,
Oh, okay.
California.
Mm-hmm.
Not long after the children were born, they began to do sex with other couples and to drink heavily. Bored with her husband, Sabrina then met a man 11 years younger than she, Jonathan Hearn, who was a medic and a fireman. Their affair began in 2012, and by the next year they were eager to marry. Both of them were given a kind of given to a kind of treacly religiosity and to a Hallmark card sentimentality as about how God had willed their being together, and how eager he, that's God, was to see them united.
So very religious people as well, then, huh?
Yes,
I would assume.
and outwardly. All of this was enunciated on their innumerable calls made on their burner phones to avoid detection. They would arrange clandestine meetings for sex while Robert was still alive, but many of the calls were spent planning how best to do away with Robert so that they could finally marry and live happily ever after.
Ah, the fairy tale wedding. Just gotta get through the murder first.
Yeah. They had first thought about poison, but that route being fraught with uncertainty, opted for shooting, but with that being the surer method, and Jonathan having so many pistols, including semi-automatic and also some rifles. Sabrina persuaded Jonathan to kill Robert while he was at work at his job, which was fixing trains when they developed mechanical problems. That was the husband's job. In a certain area where there was frequent trouble with the trains and so on. So Robert then carried out his assignment in 2014, for which Sabrina was, of course, a co-conspirator and an accomplice. Detectives soon began to suspect that Robert was responsible for the murder and that Sabrina knew of it. One particular dogged detective, Detective Meyer, managed to get permission from the court to have their phones tapped. He listened to their many conversations, and I mean many, many conversations, between Sabrina and Jonathan. The police had a camcorder picture of the man on a motorcycle near the scene of the crime that looked compatible with Jonathan's motorcycle. Gradually, the detectives amassed enough evidence and enough material to have both of them arrested. Also, one of these swinging couples that they had
relations with,
four people in the bed type situation, the Bernatines, they knew about the crime, and the wife, Kelly Bernatine, who had been Sabrina's best friend, then told the police about the murder plan.
So she was not only swinging with her husband, but swinging with her boyfriend too.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Then what is marriage really doesn't mean anything then?
No, just a piece of paper.
Yeah, a tax break really.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry. Go on. I just was following the story there. And
As the evidence became more convincing, the two members of the love triangle who had carried out the murder were in court for the crime. The judge gave Jonathan a 25-year sentence and Sabrina a sentence of life without parole, because she, after all, was the one that was engineering the whole thing happening. So, not much is known about the early years of either one, although Sabrina had several psychopathic traits: superficial charm, pathological lying, and manipulativeness. Jonathan was not a psychopath, rather a young man smitten with a sexy lover. Both were devout Protestants who knew their Bible thoroughly and all its passages about love and about morality. But perhaps in the current era, when the institution of marriage, while still regarded widely as sacred, is honored more often in the breach than was the case in the pre-1960s era, and acts that strike us as evil occur within the marital domain much more often than was formerly the case. Want to do that last sentence over?
Yeah, grab that one, yeah.
So both were devout Protestants, and they knew their Bible thoroughly and all its passages about love and about morality. But perhaps in the current era, when the institution of marriage, while still regarded widely as sacred, is honored more often in the breach than was the case in the pre-1960s era, and acts that strike us as evil occur within even the marital domain more often than was the case before.
I'm pretty sure monogamy is probably part of it.
Yeah. Hasn't been
Seems
for a
like
long
that with that chapter might have been
Hasn't been
skipped
for a long
over.
time.
Yeah.
It's interesting because I don't know, I didn't grow up in the city. I grew up in upstate in Syracuse. And as I may have mentioned before, my parents had a fairly large group of friends, married couples with kids and whatnot. And then in high school, I met other people,
Yeah.
and they, they were the kids of married couples, etc. And I never knew anyone who was divorced. I had heard, I think I had a girlfriend when I was a senior in high school, and she had a grandfather that they said had divorced and remarried. That was as much as I heard of divorce.
Yeah.
Everybody else, they seem to be getting along with one another. People have moments of tension.
Of
they
course.
have disagreements, but they work things out, and so the people that I grew up with were all celebrating their 30th, 40th, 50th anniversaries.
Yeah.
And that seemed to be you met someone that you felt was the right one, and so the thing you pledge when you are at the altar, in sickness and in health and in
Yeah.
poverty and until death do us part, that was the way people lived. So it seemed.
Yes. So
But-
it seemed, but
That changed.
a lot.
In the 60s, Well, the things we talked about before, women had to work during World War II to take the jobs
Yes. Of the men.
of the men, Rosie the Riveter and all that. And then the pill came, and then 72, Roe v. Wade.
Yep.
So a
Women's
woman,
rights.
if she was, especially if she were the victim of rape or something or incest and had a child, she could abort it. And so with all those things happening, there was a male backlash against the women that exercised the right to leave the marriage where the husband was battering them or being very abusive, because before the woman just had to suck
Deal
it
with
up
it,
and,
yeah.
and endure, and said, well, daddy puts food on the table.
Yeah.
So now she could leave. But then what you had then, there were a lot of very angry men, including men that became serial killers and would kill one woman after the other. That began to happen in the mid-'60s, and mass murder increased during the late mid-'60s, early '70s, especially when the semi-automatics became available.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of, and then because many boys growing up without a father, not only in the black community and the Latino community, where it's rampant, but even in the white community,
Yeah.
and people that were not so well off. So that boy growing up without a father, especially a morally firm father that says that, son, you
Shouldn't do that. Yeah.
you bring those candy bars back to the grocery store,
Yeah. Yeah. You don't steal. Yeah.
and so on. So that a lot more boys get in trouble with the law. So,
True. Yeah.
so it's
I think it's like a perfect storm of different things coming together, huh?
And 50, if you look at the divorce rate in different countries, it's around 50%, give or take. In Portugal, 74%. It's incredible numbers. So that when you go to the altar these days, a couple may make the pledge, etc., but they sort of know in the back of their mind, well, I hope it works out
But
because
there's always an escape route.
because their parents might have been divorced anyway, and then they don't really know that after the kids come and the job market changes or whatever, that it's going to last.
Yeah.
And so that they marry with a hope and a prayer, but not with the sense of certainty that they're going to stay together. And that the boy will therefore grow up with a father that
I think the
imparts
intent's
moral
changed.
lessons and so on.
Yeah, I think the intent's changed and like the meaning behind marriage.
Yeah.
Whereas myself just being one of, like you said, I didn't have I grew up in a 2-parent house, mother and stepfather, but my parents got divorced when I was 3 or 4, And the union of marriage is something that has never weighed heavy on me.
Mhm.
You know, it wasn't something that was a strived for
Yeah.
goal, or even nowadays, it's like, it's just a piece of, like you said, it's a piece of
I
paper.
remember these
the,
old movies I used to see years
the
ago.
romanticized idea of
Yeah.
the marriage seems to be what's kind of drawn out of it.
Even with a boy doing bad, there'd be movies in the 40s and 50s. Let's say the son, someone's son had done a murder, you know, and he's now facing the court, maybe life imprisonment or death penalty, and the mother's weeping. Says, "Oh, this is, you know, this is my. He was a good boy when he was, you know, and oh my God, what they're going to do." And the father would say, but Molly, you know, he did wrong, you know, and the father would
Would be the,
would be saying, you know, well, yes, he may get executed, but you know what he did was wrong, and the mother's. That was the typical example of you know the mother's, because it came out of her body. She's
Yeah.
more compassionate.
The
father's
dichotomy
more
of the whole
stern, you know,
thing,
they
yeah.
get the rules are rules, and that's how people live. You know? I remember when I must have been 10 or 11, I bought a book in the economy bookstore in Syracuse, and I think maybe the guy gave me 50 cents too much change, and my father made me take
Go
it back.
back,
So
yeah.
the next day, I walked all the way to the fucking bookstore and I gave him
the 50 cents back.
50 cents back. You know, and that was the right thing to do.
Yep.
You know, and he felt good. I did it. I felt good that I did it. The bookstore man was amazed, but he felt
Yeah, yeah, really.
it was a
One of the
win-win.
few people that will come actually return money back.
It was a, you know, the little, those days they had 50-cent piece. They don't even have them anymore.
Yeah, yeah. But nowadays, it's just like, oh, you lost it. It's my money.
Yeah.
It's look out for oneself. That seems to be the.
Yeah, it's so there's a heightened degree of narcissistic, you know, self-centeredness, egocentricity in a lot of people, more than there was back when I was growing up. You know.
Yeah, yeah. I completely agree with you on that, and it seems to be accelerating too.
Yeah.
It's getting faster and faster.
Yeah. So,
All right. So from Sabrina.
so the next one is, her name is Melinda Loveless. Funny name. So the word evil has been used often, even routinely, to describe acts of many of the murderers, rapists, and other villains who figure prominently in all this material. But in many instances, the parents of these people match or even outdo the people in the barbarity of their behavior toward their children. Mothers and fathers who are more, as I say, errant or aren't than parent. You know, they're parent without the P.
Yeah, they just aren't.
Such was the case in the family of Melinda and her two sisters with the ominous surname Loveless. Born in 1975, Melinda Loveless was the youngest daughter in this Indiana family. Along with three of her girlfriends, Melinda brutally stabbed, pummel, and burn 12-year-old Shanda Scherer. That was in 1992. Because Shanda had made love with Amanda, which was Melinda's lesbian lover. Shanda was burned alive, actually, when one of the girls went to a gas station and poured gasoline into an emptied 2-liter bottle of Pepsi, then pouring it over Shanda and setting her on fire. Shanda's wrists and ankles had been bound, and she had been beaten repeatedly on the head with a blunt object and sodomized with a foreign object before being burned beyond recognition. So the burning was maybe even more comfortable than what happened
I was
before.
gonna say, yeah, and the burning. I mean, 2 liters of gas. I don't know. Maybe a little bit gloomy here, but wouldn't you need more? 2 liters of gas doesn't seem like a lot. To set someone on fire?
Yeah,
Yeah, really?
maybe.
2 seems like you would maim someone.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like you're not trying to kill them with 2 liters of gas.
2 liters, half a gallon, a little bit more.
Yeah, I guess
I guess they could do it. It worked.
it worked, but I mean, I would not expect a Pepsi bottle full of gas.
Because she was burned beyond recognition.
Oh, okay.
But the real villain in the story of jealousy and murder is Melinda's father, Larry, a Pentecostal zealot and a psychopathic transvestite. He would wear his wife's and his daughter's underwear and makeup. Himself pathologically jealous, he was bisexual, philandering, hypersexual, gun nut, and wife beater who had years-long incestuous relations with his nieces and with all three of his daughters. He thrust guns into the vaginas of his daughters. No more
Where
Mr.
she
Nice
got it
Guy.
from, yeah.
And once choked the middle daughter, Michelle, unconscious when she tried to rescue her mother, who he was beating up. He denied that Melinda was truly his daughter, accusing the mother of whoring, though subsequent blood tests proved that, by golly, she was his
Daughter.
But Marjorie, the mother, an intensely masochistic woman, neglected her daughters outrageously, carrying on innumerable affairs by way of getting back at Larry. But she never could bring herself to divorce him for 25 years, until one day she actually witnessed him having sex with her niece, and even then the two rapidly remarried after the brief divorce.
Jesus.
This enraged Melinda, who, still only 15 and still wetting her bed, became depressed and developed a post-traumatic stress disorder and a borderline personality. All three daughters became lesbians. Melinda remarried. I'll do that.
Yeah.
Melinda remained extremely attached to her father despite the abuse and despite his killing her pets. It was in this setting that Melinda, along with her three friends, Lorraine, Hope, and Tony, killed Shonda. In the trial for Shonda's murder, Melinda and Lorraine both got 60-year sentences. The other two, briefer ones of 50 years. Well, it's still a pretty long time. There was evil upon evil in this case, some of it consisting of the injustices done by the justice system. The girls were punished with stiff sentences for the The girls were punished with stiff sentences for the depraved manner in which they tortured and murdered 12-year-old Shonda Scherer. But Larry Loveless, who had earlier been highly regarded as a Vietnam hero, and then back home as a lay preacher in the Baptist church, and even a marriage counselor, was finally in 1993 arrested for incest, rape, sodomy, and sexual battery, crimes committed mostly between 1968 and 77. Larry spent 2 years in prison awaiting trial, until spared by one of the peculiar injustices of the justice system, the statute of limitations.
Oh, run
For
out.
such crimes was only 5 years in Indiana, and so he was released. Worse, Larry was given the impact of his countless acts of depravity against all the women in his family, was the true author of the even more depraved crimes connected with Shonda's torture and murder at the hands of his daughter Melinda and Melinda's friends. Larry was the teacher, Melinda was but the pupil. The statute of limitations is, of course, not inherently unjust. It is quite reasonable in many cases. But in the case of serious sexual crimes committed years before, whose nature only comes to light many years later, and whose impact may be profound on the victims, I better read that.
Yeah.
But in the case of serious sexual crimes committed years earlier, whose nature only comes to light many years later, and whose impact may be profound on the victims, the statute may need to be modified so as not to excuse perpetrators with acts seemingly so rare or so unimaginable that were not recognized at the time they took place.
Do you think they're ever gonna get to a point to change that?
It's hard to say. The main conductor of the Metropolitan Opera, James Levine, for many years, during the time of the Harvey Weinstein, all the Predators, it became clear that some of the boys that he had known and maybe thought they could become singers or whatever, but years and years before, they came forward and told stories about his masturbating them and doing all kinds of sexual things when they were in their teens. Now, 40 years later, half a dozen of these men came forward, and they were able to finally, everyone knew about he was doing some homosexual stuff with these kids, but we didn't know the details. I knew about it from, as I may have mentioned to you, the woman I dated before I married Beth. She was the famous mezzo-soprano at the Met.
That's right, yes.
Tatiana Troyanos. And she would tell me stories about, he does all these sexual things that the Met has to pay off people or goes in the bathroom and does but no one paid any attention to it.
Yeah, we
didn't know the exact detail. If we knew the exact detail, we'd be so horrified. Oh my God, someone better say something. But it was just, he does some sexual thing. Yeah. So now, finally, the Met, they finally got the balls to dump him. And he's denying, as many of these predators do, he's denying that he ever did those things. Even though these 6 men have come forward. Yeah. That's 6 out of God knows how many. So, and the statute of limitations, because it happened all those years ago, and the statute of limitations would be 2 years and a half, 5 years, whatever. His lawyers will say, well, the statute of limitations protects my client. It's horseshit. So they should make changes in the law that if someone had done what was a serious crime X years ago but was hidden, especially because of the embarrassment for someone like a boy or even a young girl to come forward and tell, especially when she might be threatened that if he or she tells the court that the guy could kill them.
Yeah.
The way women are battered wives are intimidated from bringing charges lest the husband go the extra step and kill them altogether.
Yeah.
Or any of that. So there's many, especially women who are rapists, who are intimidated by and if they complain, they know that they're going to get fired, they're going to get hurt, whatever.
Yeah, the power trip is still over them at that point. But then, like in the case with Bill Cosby, that would have reached the statute of limitations too, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And they were able to convict him. So.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
But I think some of them, there was more recent, they continued.
Continued. There was a couple that were in the statute.
The ones the dozens and dozens that happened earlier. Well, okay, fine. But if you rape 40 people and 37 were before exhausted the statute, but 3
still had time on that clock.
You're still going to get.
So that's probably what it was then.
Yeah. Wow. There's a briefer one. This guy, Edward Leary, spelled the usual way, Leary. In a crime that had all the ingredients of mass murder, except that no one was killed, Edward Leary, a 50-year-old computer analyst, recently fired from Merrill Lynch, brought 2 fire bombs made from Hellman's mayonnaise jars, kitchen timers, batteries, and flashbulbs onto 2 Manhattan subway trains. One of the bombs went off unexpectedly in Leary's hands, burning himself over 40% of his body and injuring 4 dozen people. The mindset behind the bombings was typical of mass murderers in general. A disgruntled and angry man reacting to the loss of a job or of a love relationship. When Leary was arrested and tried, the judge called him a vengeful and self-aggrandizing man, adding that evil exists in the world, no reason for it, it's just there.
Good way to look at it.
The judge sentenced Leary to 94 years in prison for the December 94 bombings. Maybe he picked the number for the year anyway. The defense attorneys in the case tried to argue that Leary was driven mad by an incompatible. I'll do that over. The defense attorneys in the case tried to argue that Leary was, quotes, driven mad by an incompatible mixture of drugs to treat depression, Prozac, Effexor, and a mild anti-anxiety drug called Buspar. This form of absurd defense has a modern ring to it. Reminiscent of the now infamous Twinkie defense, used in the 1979 trial of policeman Dan White, who assassinated San Francisco Mayor George Moscone and the supervisor Harvey Milk. That was an anti-gay crime.
Okay.
So,
Yeah.
the notion was eating those sugary snacks had worsened his existing mood swings and had somehow rendered White incapable of the premeditation required for rational thought. I mean, come on,
Kamehos and
guys.
ringdings, yeah.
The jurors were apparently hoodwinked by that silly argument, such that White was convicted of involuntary manslaughter rather than murder one. The Twinkie defense has become the catchword of improbable legal defenses cooked up by defense attorneys who are more committed to winning than to justice.
No truer words have been said.
Martin McNeill, that's Macneil.
Okay.
Martin McNeill came from a chaotic and wildly dysfunctional and impoverished family in Camden, New Jersey. The parents were divorced. The father, who had abandoned the family, was alcoholic. The mother supported the 6 children via prostitution, the children listening to the grunts of her clients. Of Martin's 5 siblings, 2 committed suicide, 1 died of a heroin overdose, and another died of alcoholism. So and then there was one.
And then there was one. It's horrible to laugh at, but yeah. So sad.
Martin was handsome and bright and was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. He was briefly in the army, but he was let out because of mental illness, which he managed to parlay into veterans' benefits, which he conned the system into continuing all the rest of his life. When he was 19, he switched from Catholicism to the Latter-day Saints and moved to Utah as a member of the Mormon community. 2 years later, he committed a large check fraud of some $35,000, but was caught and spent 6 months in jail. Then he went to Mexico, and he somehow managed to get into medical school in Guadalajara.
It's probably not hard.
No, I don't think so. From there, he went to California and got into a school of osteopathy, conning his way into a degree. Right after that, he conned his way yet again, this time into law school, managing to end up with a degree in law besides the one in osteopathy, allowing him to fix the LLD to his MD degree. People who knew him considered him cold, rude, arrogant, dishonest, narcissistic, intimidating, and a braggart, as well as lacking in medical skills. So much for the good side. The bad side was that he met while in Utah a woman from a well-respected Mormon family. She was quite beautiful, had been a model, but was swept off her feet by McNeill, not listening to her parents, who didn't trust him. He threatened to commit suicide if she left him, a time-honored trick that often works with naive women of her personality type, sweet, trusting, and easily cowed into submission. So they did marry. Michelle, maiden name was Summers, was one of 7 children. Her parents had divorced when she was 20. They lived luxuriously in a huge house. That's when she married McNeill, and he set himself up as a medical doctor, in quotations. At home, he was argumentative and offended Michelle by watching pornography, which is forbidden among the LDS adherents. He was an inveterate philanderer who had sex with one of his female patients, besides having raped other women. They had 4 children in rapid succession: Rachel, who was bipolar like her father; Vanessa, a heroin addict; Alexis, who became a medical doctor; and Damien, also bipolar, and later committed suicide. Vanessa had gotten pregnant by a man she met in her late teens. Her daughter, Ada, also then lived with the McNeils, and in addition, they adopted 4 girls from the Ukraine.
Jesus.
Noel, Elle, Giselle, and Sabrina. Martin continued to work various scams to enrich himself, but these were not directed from. Martin continued to work various scams to enrich himself, but these were not detected for many years. Meantime, the whole family of 11 lived in luxury. There were times when Michelle sensed that Martin was cheating on her, and because of his hypercritical, bullying nature, suspected that as the marriage began to deteriorate, she might end up dead. She told some friends that were she to end up dead, Martin would be the one who had killed her. When they had been married 30 years, Michelle was now 50, Martin grew tired of her and became enamored of a rebellious hot number, Gypsy Will Willis, a woman 20 years younger than Michelle, and who had shamed her Mormon family by having a child out of wedlock, raised by her parents, who then had nothing more to do with her. Martin now hatched a plot to kill Michelle so as to avoid the nuisance of divorce and child support. Meantime, taking advantage of acquiring an accidental death insurance policy, one that pays double in the case of death by an accident.
Ooh.
Martin began to complain of minor facial imperfections in Michelle, including crow's feet, lines near her eyes, and insists that she have cosmetic surgery on 5 different parts of her face with 5 different sorts of plastic surgery, all at the same time. He managed to find a plastic surgeon who was willing to do all that. Martin then persuades him to prescribe anti-anxiety pills and opiate painkillers. Once back home, Michelle is groggy from all the surgery, and Martin crushes all the pills together and gives the whole mixture via enema, assuming that the opiates will kill her. They didn't quite kill her, so he then drowns her in the bathtub. Pretending she is still alive, he dials 911 for emergency help, meantime pretending to do fake resuscitation maneuvers and pretending also that he can't get her out of the tub, having faked a foot injury that rendered him, in quotation marks, too weak to lift her out all by himself. The emergency team arrives, realizes that she is probably dead, but pro forma takes her to the hospital anyway in case somehow she were still revivable. At this point, Martin hires his mistress, Gypsy, to whom he has now given a new name as the nanny, in quotation marks, for the smaller children. She is now Jillian Giselle McNeil, as though they were married, and as though she were some nurse that he had gotten to know through the hospital. Michelle's sister, Linda, is convinced that Martin had killed her and spends the next several years gathering bits of evidence that will ultimately lead to his arrest and conviction. Martin now begins to molest his two of his daughters, which also came to light. The whole truth does not come out for 6 years. Martin is finally jailed in 2012, awaiting trial. While in jail, he acknowledges to his bunkmate that he had held Michelle's head under the water. But the bunkmate was a snitch who testified against him at the trial. The jury convicted him of murder as well as molestation of 2 of his daughters. The court gave him 2 15-year sentences, adding that evil had prevailed. Alexis, the daughter who became a physician, said, "My father's evil did not begin or end with the murder of my mother. Shortly after my mother's death, my father sexually assaulted me on 2 different occasions. He destroyed my world and created a living nightmare in its place." 3 years after his incarceration, McNeil, then 60 in 2017, was found dead in the Utah State Prison, probably by suicide. What is special about the McNeil case is the sheer and malevolent artistry that he brings to our label of the psychopath.
The scamming.
There have always been fraudsters and mountebanks and men who've fleece the public by selling fake nostrums. There are few who have successfully impersonated a variety of other highly successful men, tricked wealthy women into marriage, and committed murder along the way. Another example, besides McNeil, was the equally clever German-born Gerhard Gerhardsreiter, who moved to the U.S. and began to use such aliases as Chris Crow, Chip Smith, and Clark Rockefeller. Mostly he fooled well-to-do women into marrying him, but along the way did murder Jonathan and Linda Sohos, for which, after much trouble in identifying who he really was, is now serving a 27-year sentence in a California prison. McNeil is an impostor of perhaps even greater skills, at least initially, having carried off during a 40-year career, fooling others as a fake Mormon, a fake lawyer, a fake doctor, doing fake CPR while his wife was just murdered, and being a cheating husband and an incestuous father. McNeil was never true to anyone. By committing murder, McNeil and Gerhardsreiter also differ from many of the previous con artists, named, by the way, after Herman Melville's book, The Confidence Man, that he published on April Fool's Day in 1857. In that, the con men usually trick people out of their money and they rarely murder. There are other con men in the current post-60s era who kill not for money, but to escape humiliation for their lying, as in the case of Mark Hacking, who was also from Utah and a real doctor, while he pretended to be a doctor, who killed his wife in 2004 when she discovered that he had lied to her about being a physician.
It was a good reason to kill someone, just like you said. To cover your ass.
Yeah.
Cover your ass from your lies. Wow.
Okay, so
Thank you again.